Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Penn Vicarage on this Thursday morning. Hope you're well. Hope you're having a good week. And thank you for joining us for our Bible reflection today. Continuing through the challenging but remarkably wonderful book of the prophet Amos. So put your hard hats and your flak jackets on. Amos and chapter 2. Here goes. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Moab and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because he burned to lime the bones of the king of Edom. So I will send a fire on Moab, and it shall devour the strongholds of Kerioth. And Moab shall die amid uproar, amid shouting and the sound of the trumpet. I will cut off the ruler from its midst, and will kill all its officials with him, says the Lord. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they've rejected the law of the Lord, have not kept his statutes, but they've been led astray by the same lies with which their ancestors walked. So I will send a fire on Judah, and it shall devour the strongholds of Jerusalem. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals. Those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth, and push the afflicted out of the way. Father and son go in to the same girl, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar, on garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they shall drink wine bought with fines they imposed. Yet I destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of cedars, and who was as strong as the oaks. I destroyed his fruit above, and his roots beneath. Also I brought you up out of the land of Egypt, and led you for 40 years in the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorite. And I raised up some of your children to be prophets, and some of your youths to be Nazarites. Is it not indeed so, O people of Israel, says the Lord? But you made the Nazarites drink wine, and commanded the prophets, saying, you shall not prophesy. So I will press you down in your place, just as a cart presses down when it's full of sheaves. Flight shall perish from the swift, and the strong shall not retain their strength, nor shall the mighty save their lives. Those who handle the bow shall not stand, and those who are swift of foot shall not save themselves. Nor shall those who ride horses save their lives, and those who are stout of heart among the mighty shall flee away naked in that day, says the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so to set the scene here, you have 2 kings of Judah and Israel. You have Jeroboam II in Israel, and you have Uzziah in Judah. And both those kings had been kings for a very long time. And having been a king for such a long time, that most complacency kicked in. The problem is that they had times of great prosperity, because politically times were good around them. Assyria was quiet and all on the back foot and so on, and it was all a bit quiet at the time. And complacency had kicked in. The trouble is, you see, the Bible makes it clear that Uzziah and Jeroboam II were not good kings. They are both kings who had rejected God's way. They did what was described as evil in the sight of the Lord. They weren't living life God's way. They weren't ruling God's way, and the most horrendous complacency had kicked in. And the interesting thing is that the people couldn't see it. They all thought, "I'm all right, Jack. We're fine. Things obviously good with us. We're absolutely fine. I'm all right, Jack. Thanks very much." But the one person who could see it was Amos, and he's the one who could see it. And I guess if you look at chapter 1 and chapter 2, you can almost imagine the drama here when Amos starts. And he starts sending out some words of God, of judgment on nations around. And he starts with Damascus, and he goes on to Gaza and Tyre and Edom and Adam and Ammon and Moab and so on. And he has some firm, harsh things, some tough things you might say about them. And you can imagine the people of Judah and the people of Israel sitting there feeling terribly smug, going, "I'm all right, Jack, thanks very much." Probably, because these people were sort of old enemies of Judah and Israel, you could almost then quite enjoying listening to God. They listen to these words of judgment of the nations, thinking, probably quite enjoying this. Huge amounts of smugness kicking in. What they don't realise is that these words of judgment are not they're not sort of general rants. They're actually very carefully laid out. And if you read carefully, actually, the noose is tightening around Judah and Israel, but they don't realise it. You see, Damascus, Gaza and Tyre are like the only links between them and Israel and Judah are political. Okay, they just happen to be in the same area. But as he moves on, he goes on to Edom, Ammon, and Moab. If you go back to times of Abraham and so on, those countries were actually had some. They were actually related to the people of Israel and the people of Judah. So in a sense, you can sort of see these words of judgment getting closer and closer and closer to home. But nonetheless, these were still old enemies of Israel and Judah, and you can imagine them sitting there feeling terribly, terribly smug. And we're all right, Jack. Thanks very much. And as I say, probably quite enjoying listening to these things being said. And you do get it sometimes. You can get people in church and so on who quite enjoy ranting and raving about society around and feeling terribly, terribly, terribly smug. The kind of holier than thou bit. Quite enjoying listening to what potentially might be words of judgment on the terrible society around it, and whilst feeling terribly, terribly smug at the same time. But as I said, Amos could see what they couldn't see, which is the huge amounts of complacency that had kicked in. And you can imagine when he gets to verse 4 of chapter 2, for 3 transgressions of Judah and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. And you can imagine a kind of audible gasp around the room. They'd forgotten, of course, that when you point the finger at someone, you point 3 fingers back at yourself. And he goes on to say, because they've rejected the law of the Lord, have not kept his statutes, but have been led astray by the same lies which their ancestors did. So Jeroboam in Israel, for example, was a bad king, and he was one of his predecessors, the original Jeroboam the first, had been the person who'd taken Israel into his path of sin and so on. And basically what he's saying is you feel terribly complacent, but actually the punishment's coming because you've rejected God's way. You have God's way and you've rejected it just like your ancestors did. And it's no use looking back at, borrowed grace from the past because actually your ancestors fallen away as well. So what he's saying is, for 3 transgressions of Judah, I will not revoke the punishment because they have rejected the law of the Lord. And there's a thought here that, you may feel terribly complacent. You may feel terribly, terribly good, but actually you've rejected God. You're doing your own way rather than God's way. And then he turns to Israel in verse 6 and following. And in a sense, it gets kind of even worse here. And in verses 6 to 7, you find where Israel's gone wrong because they have basically sold out, they mistreated the poor, because they have they sell the righteous for silver, the needy for a pair of sandals, those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. So these people have turned against God. They've also mistreated the poor, and God always has a soft spot for the poor and the needy in the Bible. So they've rejected God's law. They've also started mistreating and abusing them and selling out the poor, so to speak. Then in verses 7 and 8, you get the fact that the implication here is that they've kind of not just ignored God's will, but actually openly defied it. This thing about father and the son going into the same girl. And the implication here is, and lay themselves down beside every. I mean, in a sense, this is something which is expressly forbidden, and that you get the impression it's a kind of act of defiance. Not only are they ignoring God's will, but they're openly defying it. Take garments taken in pleasure in the house of their God. They drink wine bought with fines they own imposed. So they are. So the picture is of people who have ignored God's will. They have mistreated the poor and have openly defied God's will, and so on, and that's kind of where they got to. And then he goes on in verses 9, 10, and 11 to talk about how good God's been in the past. God is the one who prepared the way for them. God's the one who prepared the way through the Amorites so they could get to the promised land. God's the one who set them free from Egypt. God's the one who'd led them through the wilderness. And I gave you Nazarites. Nazarites were holy people at the time who can kind of keep them. So God has given them everything they need. God's given them every opportunity to go to do things his way. But despite that, they still do it their own way instead. They still prefer their own way. So what you've got here is they must have been thoroughly enjoyed listening to all this judgment was being poured out on other nations. Then they find it's all put out on them. They find that they have forgotten God's will. They have mistreated the poor. They've openly defied and blasphemed God in their actions. This is despite the fact that God's been so good to them in the past. And not only not only that they've made the holy people drink wine, which they weren't supposed to do as well. So and they've stopped them prophesying, and they've kind of shut them up as well. So they've kind of smashed their consciences as well. So in the end, in verses 13 to the end, God says, in a sense, okay, you've made your own bed and you can lay in it. And you think you're terribly clever, you think you're terribly strong, but actually, your swift horses won't work anymore. Your strength will, if you don't want my help, you won't get it, because you're not fast enough, you're not strong enough, you're not bright enough. But if that's the way you want to play it, that's the way it will be. And that is what, in the end, if that's what the people really want, that's what God says, that's what he will do. You see something similar in Romans in chapter 1. So what you have here, this is not just some great rant. This is a carefully laid out. And the people who thought they were terribly complacent, who thought the I'm all right, Jack, who thought that judgment only applied to other people, needed to take a big look inside themselves. They got complacent. They turned their back on God. They sold out the poor. They were defying God's will despite everything God had done for them. And I really do think, actually, today we need to listen to the similar words today. What is God saying to us? Looking back and reminding ourselves of the times that God has blessed us, God's guided us, God saved us, and so on. God has been so good to us, my friends, Let's make sure that we are listening to God. Let's make sure we are treating the poor properly. Let's make sure that we are honouring God in our lives. And let's make sure that we are remembering what God has done for us. Do this in remembrance of me. My friends, God bless you, as Jesus said. God bless you. Have a lovely day. Thanks for watching. Do please share a message with your friends.